Hello again. I thought your audio was quiet, but it turned out that my headphones were just very quiet. So
Oh, yeah.
it was fine. How are you anyway?
Yeah, not too bad. I've had quite a hectic day, to be honest. I'm just kind of like taking a moment like, to chill. But yeah, it's
Chilling
been
out.
good. I've got a lot done, so that's cool. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm a little lethargic. Don't know why. I think it's the weather.
Yeah,
Potentially the weather.
absolutely. Typical
Um,
week, isn't it?
I think everyone I spoke to this week has been. Everyone's just said it's just been a little bit meh, a bit
Mm.
low energy. I don't really know. Um, but yeah, I mean, my podcast is fairly unstructured, so
Okay.
I will warn you. In which case, welcome to Yellow Concrete Podcast, Kim. Oh,
Oh,
yeah. So you said you recorded a podcast recently with
I
someone.
did, yeah. I did one with a polyester zine, sort of like an independent zine, about it's a series they're doing with creatives where they just choose somebody to talk about something that they're obsessed with. So I picked horror films, but it was a really good chat actually. We like the girl who was interviewing me. She'd recently just written a paper on like gender and social politics in horror films, which kind of nicely bounced off some of the things that I wanted to talk about. So yeah, that should be. I'm not sure when that's out actually, but it was yeah. I just like talking about things that I'm obsessed with, so it was
That's good.
enjoyable.
That's good. And it plays into the themes of this podcast, where I basically just let the guest pick the topic, because then
Yeah, it's similar deal. Sure.
we can discuss. I was trying to figure out if we'd ever actually spoken in person.
Um, it's possible. Like not to be rude, but I might have been drunk and like just forgot.
Well, no, because so I know of your work.
Mhm.
For those listening, I class you as an illustrator because that's what you class yourself as online. Is that fairly
Yeah,
accurate?
definitely.
Yeah. So I know
Yeah.
your work from seeing it at Zine Fest in Nottingham
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was
and
there. Yeah.
and seeing that. And I remember thinking it was like seeing your work, and but then me at Zine Fest, I tend to just like shut down anyway because I hate talking to strangers. Um, And it's always one of those. It's weird. I hate talking to strangers. Yeah, I hit people up and say, "Hey, do you want to come talk for an hour?" It's a counterbalance. Um, but yeah, I remember I was like, I feel like I'd seen you again at some point, but I couldn't remember if we'd ever spoken in person. Whereas you're a person whose work who I followed because you've got a style which I really appreciate. Um, and I was like, yeah, it'd be interesting to get you on. Mhm. Yeah. So
Yeah,
I
I was
mean,
definitely at that.
you definitely at that scene first.
Yeah, that's as much as I can remember.
That's fair. That's fair. Um, so, I mean, for anyone kind of listening, what would you describe what you do as? Which I know is a hard question.
Um, so basically, I'm probably known more on platforms like Instagram for my personal work. Ultimately, I'm a freelance illustrator, so I do my main work that I do is sort of commercial illustration and live art. So, I do bits of like branding and things like that, and all sorts really storyboarding, book illustration, live art portraiture, and workshops and things. So that's my main work. But then on the side, I've kind of got an outlet for my personal work, which is more just yeah, I make illustrations which are basically about empowered women a lot of the time. Really influenced by kind of just retro kitsch, like trash exploitation aesthetic.
Yeah.
Mixture of kind of modern, like my ethos is, kind of very social, modern commentary in politics, and that combined with a sense of nostalgia and like the fun of, kind of 60s, 70s aesthetic.
I find because I like your stuff because it treads a line which I've never been able to find of being like artistically led because it's illustration that kind of thing, but also enough within a graphic design realm to be kind of bold and postery like that, like vintage and all this kind of retro future stuff. Whereas I always every time I get into kind of like anything bold and graphic, I automatically go, no, I can't do this, and I put that aside. Whereas it's like, if it's sketchy and messy, I'm all over that. But if it's graphic in any way, I just struggle with it. So whenever I see kind of it executed well, I'm like, yes, this is great. This is what what should be.
Well, it's interesting you think that, because it's, I suppose you don't really stop and think about the way that your work necessarily comes across when you're making it. And I really like
Hmm.
hearing other people describe it, because I find it really hard to describe what I do. Like, you just ask me then, I'm thinking, what is it that I do? And
It's a big
when people
question.
say, "I'll describe the work to me," yeah. But yeah, it's, I think you've nailed it. Like, that's kind of what I'm trying to go for, a sense of, I mean, it's definitely, I've spent a lot of time absorbing kind of that. I guess the graphic poster thing makes a lot of sense. I've just got so much kind of mentally stored in terms of just that particular style of old film posters and
Hmm.
big posters and things like that. So everything ends up in this particular format, which probably references that. But then my background is fine art and painting and things like that. So it's kind of a combination of those two, really.
I was going to say, like, is this a style which you've kind of always done? Like, is this back when you kind of like started making things? Was it always in your head of like, yeah, pop culture poster, go down that kind of lead, or was it more you kind of developed it along with your other
Yeah,
interests?
yeah, I think it definitely has developed, particularly over the last maybe sort of 4 years. I definitely didn't start out making art that looked like this. I'll have to like maybe share some on one of my platforms, because there's quite. I think I started to develop a style. I studied illustration at Manchester Met University, and I think that's
Mm.
when I started to develop a style. But this was like, gosh, ages ago, early 2000s, and there was a really distinctive way. It's funny how like trends happen in illustration. I think the whole naive art movement and things like David Shrigley and like artists who were quite just raw, and it wasn't necessarily about technique.
Yeah.
That was quite popular. So I think I had a bit of a period of making this quite dark, scratchy biro stuff. Didn't really know how to use colour. I'd always do things in black and white. Wasn't using like inks and brushes at all. So that was the beginning of like my sort of foray into illustration, and it's completely different. It was probably a lot darker in a way that I don't know if it's just a bit embarrassing now. I have to drag it out and have a look. But yeah, I think it's taken a while, if I'm honest. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
definitely taken a while for me to hone it down into, I don't know, I suppose like as a creative yourself, it's hard to be satisfied, isn't it, a lot of the time with what you've created and
Oh,
decide, right.
definitely. I think as well that you end up in that, or at least I definitely end up in a trap of not wanting to be like typecast for my artwork, and I worry about kind of doing the same thing over and over again. And I mean, I've shown work to people before, and they said, "Oh yeah, you can tell it's by you," and instantly in the back of my head, I'm like, "Shit." Like, you shouldn't be able to tell it's by me. I've tried to give something differently.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah. I think that isn't necessarily always a bad thing to have a strong
yeah,
visual style, but I know what you mean. If you deliberately try to kind of steer away from
yeah.
something, then yeah.
I think as well, like especially when you get to doing it like professionally, like you do with your kind of freelance work as well. I think especially for younger artists, they don't realize it takes a lot of time to kind of develop to that point where it's like, yeah, this is what I'm known for. This is the work which people know me for.
Oh God, yeah, it really does, and I think that's a really important point to raise. Especially, I mean, things have changed a huge amount since I graduated in, God, show me, 2007, I think it was, and there wasn't, like we weren't taught about things like social media, and you
Mhm.
didn't have it really. I didn't even have a laptop, so I just did
Yeah,
everything, very kind of analog, and it was just a different world. And I remember being so kind of stressed out by the notion of finding, like a visual identity, and almost just there were a handful of people around me who I admired who had managed to find it quite quickly. I
yeah,
think that's actually quite rare, and I think even just the fact of, I spent a lot of years after uni. I didn't go straight into making art. I'd do it on the side, but I spent time on the dole, and then just kind of doing odd temp jobs, a lot of admin, and I
mm,
think just trying to figure out what it was I wanted to do with my illustration, and just gradually building up contacts and constantly working in my spare time. And it's not, for most people, it's not a straight road. So I guess that shouldn't deter people from, like wanting to keep going, because it just takes a bit of time, really.
yeah. I think there's definitely there's a balance to be struck. I think is the way I always put it. Is because I mean, like I took a quite a similar route. I mean, I studied photography and film at university, and I wanted to go into all of that, and I wanted to make films. And when I came out, we were in the classic double recession. Um,
Oh,
and it was kind of, well, what do I do? Where do I get a job? And I live in Lincolnshire, so there is no media jobs. So I started doing temp work and I set up my own kind of t-shirt business, and it was through that I actually started getting back into making artwork. And then even now, like my full-time job isn't necessarily creative. Is that this is just all stuff I do on the background to keep going. Um,
yeah, I think that's the important thing. It's like I don't think it's bad to have, like different
hmm,
methods of making a living as long as you can manage some sort of creative outlet. It's not like I don't think it's weird. I think people, especially as a student, I think I almost assumed that there was this very straightforward trajectory, but even just finding the work just takes, time to kind of try things out, figure out what it is your strengths are, like meet people, kind of talk to people who might want you to do something for them, and just,
hmm.
yeah, like working out what's feasible. And yeah, there's a lot that goes into getting to the point where you can kind of comfortably maybe say, right, this is what I do, this is who I am, and like this is what I'm going to put it towards.
Yeah, I think as well, you kind of get to a point of where you feel like you have to declare that you're an artist now. That you do it so long as like, oh, this is just what I do in my spare time, or this is something which I'm kind of working on, or this is the work I make, or but I'm actually just I'm an accountant and I go do that and blah blah blah. And then at some point you're like, no, actually, at some point on my profile I should write I'm an artist. Like this is part of what I do.
Yeah, I think it's really weird. Like, I've had a lot of conversations about this, and there's like, I guess it's partly imposter syndrome as well. I think a lot of creative people perhaps aren't entirely comfortable with claiming it. I don't know why. Even if you've been doing, like, I mean, I've been doing art in some form for like basically my entire life, but whenever people ask me what I do, there's a bit in the back of my mind that just feels a bit stupid, being like, oh, you're an artist. Like,
I
not like it's not real, or I don't know, like I can't justify, even though I am, it just feels a
yeah,
bit awkward for me to say so.
I think no, I think that's a truth of kind of doing art though. I think as soon as you start to explain it, it sounds ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's the same with like when you kind of explain kind of doing any work when someone's like, oh, so you've drawn this, fantastic. What's it about? As soon as you start to kind of deconstruct it, you're like, it sounds ridiculous because it sounds so simple, and it's taken me a year and a half to produce this piece of work, and they're standing there going, why did this take you a year and a half? This is fairly straight to the point. It's like, yes, but it took me a year and a half to figure out how to say it in a single sentence.
Yeah.
And I think that's true of like being an artist. Um, I mean that's a good kind of good segue, nice segue, um, into what we kind of discussed as a topic, which was looking at kind of comics and graphic novels.
Yeah,
Is that
definitely.
something which you has like? Did you? I guess a question. Did you know about comics and graphic novels before you started drawing, or were you drawing and then someone handed you comics?
A bit of a combination. Like as a kid, my brother used to be obsessed with like Beano comics, and
Mm,
he had like a, like at the news agent, you'd get like a subscription, and he used to get
yep.
them in every week, and I'd just read them when he'd finished with them. So I think I was kind of interested in sequential storytelling from that point, like as a kid. And I used to kind of make my own little books and stuff. So like not necessarily, yeah, sort of like illustrated little stories and things. I was obsessed with making those. But I suppose like the comics and graphic novel side of things, I only really got into probably sort of a few years after uni when I came across was a combination of things. I think I had done a kind of like paid internship with Lime Pictures, which is the production company which makes things like Hollyoaks and Anyways
Mm,
Essex, like all those classic shows. And I got off the back of that to do some art department for a film. It was a BBC film for kids. And it was one of those roles where you're doing a bit of everything. And I got to do some storyboarding. So I
okay.
think just kind of noticing the correlation between storyboarding and, kind of telling a story in that
Oh, I think I may have lost
nice
connection.
those parallels, and just start to see that as an art form that would be really useful to me, but also really enjoy the storytelling element of it as well. I think as a sort of form of telling, just explaining a narrative, graphic novels are kind of at the forefront for me. I think they do a really good job of it.
So that's quite, I'd say that's quite late in life to kind of pick up graphic novels and
Yeah,
comics.
definitely. Yeah.
I mean, I guess I'm quite similar to your brother in the sense of, so me and my brother we used to have Beano and Dandy. And those were like the two magazines we used to get, always get. He used to get the Beano and I used to get the Dandy. And then my mum introduced us to like, used to be able to get singlets, which were like small square ones. And there was like, it was basically singular comics from those episodics, which would come out. And there was one called Banana Man, and that was like everything which I wanted to be. Um, but then I kind of from that led me into more serious, kind of like graphic and story arcs. But then my brother was obsessed with like Americana, so he was obsessed with the idea of getting like Marvel and DC comics and everything like that. But then I mean, let's say your work you describe as kind of folk horror.
Yeah, I'd say that's a big part of it. That's sort of something that I'm always drawn to
Is that
as
mixed
a
in with like Americana and stuff? Because there's a lot
I
of that
think
blend.
it's funny because when you said Americana and then talked about the sort of comics, I think almost when I was younger, that's what I assumed comics to be, and I didn't
Mm,
realize you could have like graphic novels, and there was this whole other world of comics. So, and I've never been super drawn to particularly superhero centered stuff unless it's a bit dark.
mm,
Like I think there's obviously some incredible standout work within that side of the genre, but yeah, I suppose that kind of maybe is what put me off a bit, which is really weird. Like I can appreciate that format now, but the Americana linked to folklore, I would say that folklore to me is actually something quite distinctly British. I guess
yeah.
that's because of the films that I enjoy within the genre, but yeah, there's definitely a side of Americana folklore and folk horror that is it's just completely different. Like
Yeah.
I think particularly any sort of like a cult and witch trials type stuff. You've obviously got like a large history of that in America as well. So yeah, I suppose that element of things and like any sort of just there's some really good comics about like deep south and like just like
Yeah.
weird satanic occult practice and stuff. So I guess it kind of ties in. Yeah.
I always find it interesting kind of looking at when US kind of artists pick up British things to kind of look at. And when they kind of because a lot of them get obsessed with kind of like the old medieval times and all the things which they didn't really have in the US, whereas over here we kind of get obsessed with the bits which we didn't have and go, oh, cowboys and everything like that. It's like, oh well, we never had that here, so how do I get into that? And it's weird as we both look at each other's countries and go, ooh, we could borrow that and we can make stories about that and
Yeah, yeah,
I'm very
100%.
similar. Like, I never really got into I got into superheroes, but only through like Batman,
Yeah, definitely.
and that was the only one which kind of picked up. And I went, yeah, I really want to know more about this guy, but it was because he was a guy. It wasn't like, oh, I'm able to run through walls. It was like, no, this is just a guy, and that's why I'm curious about him.
Yeah, that sort of bit of realism that it doesn't seem really far fetched.
Yeah, well, the same. I think like British comics as well. I think a lot of it never seemed anything kind of unrealistic because there always seemed to be like a weakness. There always seemed to be something which gave you that edge of realism or a little bit weird. Like even with Beano and Dandy, when you look back at through that stuff, you look at it and go, actually, most of this is fairly grotesque. Like stylistically, story wise, it's not like a clear cut and dry of what's right and wrong. Most of the stories follow bullies, and most of the stories follow like the outcast of society. Like, I don't know what it picks up. But do you have like a favorite graphic novel or like a go-to artist, or is
Oh
that
gosh,
too big of a question?
I've got a bit of a pile at my feet that if you
Okay.
want me to reference in terms of your questions, but I'd say my maybe not necessarily a favorite because I've picked up a lot more along the way, but I
Mhm.
think the one that properly got me into graphic novels was picking up the Hernandez brothers Love and Rockets series. in my local library. I think I was like in my early 20s, and that was, as I say, around the time that I was sort of becoming a storyboard artist as well. And that just completely blew my mind. I think what you're saying about elements of realism and sort of relatability, and yeah, there not always being like a clear sort of evil or good, and like the character that you're supposed to back maybe shifting, and things like that. I hadn't really come across in that format before. So just the combination of storytelling and just like completely expert penmanship, like the Hernandez brothers who kind of start creating these comics. I think they all trained from a very, very young age to just like draw the human figure. And there's just like such a cleanness of line, but then this kind of very like engaging, in-depth storytelling and cast of characters that are really fully fleshed out, which you kind of like go on a journey with. And I think there's something about that that's just stayed with me. So even though I've kind of come across a lot of artists who would be up there as really important, I'd say that they were kind of instrumental in helping me to kind of delve deeper into graphic novels.
No, it's interesting. It's interesting as well. You kind of like you focused on the idea that they draw figures because obviously within your work you draw a lot of portraits, and
Yeah,
and
I
and
think
that's something which you show like fantastic skill in. And whereas I personally don't draw a lot of portraits, it's just something which I actively avoid it. So it's interesting
yeah,
that
I think
you do that.
avoid certain things for sure. Like I don't know what, I just find people really, really interesting, and just there's something magic to me about being able to capture a mood or a person's character and manner in just a really simple line drawing. And I think that definitely probably also, coming across their work probably also definitely made me think differently about how I drew, to be honest. And
Okay.
just considering just drawing the human figure differently, because they've just got this very specific, both of the Hernandez brothers who do illustrations have a specific style.
That's interesting. As well, like I think the way you create work, or from my kind of view of when I see it as well, is like you focus on figures which are obviously icons most of the time, um, but in their own right, the way you draw them makes them look more mythical and more like, I mean, essentially makes them into characters. It makes them into the kind of people you would throw into a graphic novel and go, yeah, this is the protagonist of this story. So I find that really interesting, just kind of blending that together. I mean,
Yeah, I'm
so
sure it's been picked up along the way from comics, as you say. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, with the whole kind of um, like retro, like future and folk horror and everything like that, is there somewhere kind of within your background of media consumption, like some point where you were like, yeah, this is for me, or like you watched a film, or is it just that kind of like that series of comics where you were like, yeah, this is how I want to go with this?
I think it's weird, like, to be honest, like, without going off topic too much, it's a combination of things. And I've been thinking about this like over the lockdown period, and doing these different podcasts and talking about my interests. And I think my general interest in things, I'm really, really obsessed with just being spooked, and
Okay.
just kind of just like weird battles between good and evil that aren't straightforward. And like, I do wonder, and just like weird gore and stuff, and I find it almost soothing to watch horror films. And I've been reading about it and stuff and having to think about what it is in my background that started it. And I was raised, I mean, I'm not super religious now, but I was raised quite Christian and had all these sort of like kids, like a Bible but for children. It'd be all illustrated and stuff, but they wouldn't pull any punches, relaying these
Yeah.
kind of quite violent Bible stories. And I do wonder sometimes if that kind of sowed the seeds for like this enjoyment of horror and storytelling, because it's quite horrific, like a lot of the stuff in the Bible is really, really scary. So,
Yeah.
and I had also, when I was young, I had, like older aunties, especially on my dad's side, who, when we'd visit them, I mean, they'd just put on horror films. Like, so like from quite a young age, from the age of 8 and stuff, I was seeing stuff
Yeah.
that maybe I've been watching, like the, Freddy Krueger films and Terminator films and just, The Thing, stuff like that. So I think it's probably more film that began it. And then when I was able to find that same sort of line of just stuff that I was into in comics, that's when I kind of got really hooked on particular styles of comic book as well.
Okay. Do you find yourself like picking up the same types of comic books now then? Just like the same styles, same stories, or are you one of those people who just like see something like, yeah, well, we'll try this or we'll try this and
I think I'm quite particular. Like I tend to like stuff with a strong female lead, some sort of. I like an element of fantasy, but I also like gritty realism.
hmm,
So things that it can be, it doesn't have to be all of those things at once, but I think those things always, make me think, oh, I'll give this a read. But it's a combination of story and obviously the illustration itself is really, really important to me. But I do find that if I've got a bit of a pal on the go at the moment. I've treated myself to a few new ones since lockdown, just because I want to, like just being on my phone all the time is doing
yeah.
that too, like, as we
You've
all
got to
are.
you've got to have a little media collection. As soon as lockdown clicked
Yeah,
in, it's like I've
yeah,
got to have this little pile. Just order a few things, just in case, you know.
yeah, exactly. And yeah, I definitely tend to just do a bit of a search of our best horror graphic novels or whatever from like the last few years. So yeah, bit stuck in a rut of doing that, but I just really enjoy them. So
I was actually struggling. I was because I was trying to think of the last kind of horror graphic novel I'd read, and the only one I could think of was Lock and Key.
oh, I love that series. Yeah.
And but outside of that, I've not really read anything horror graphic that I can remember that vividly said to me, "This is a horror." Apart from maybe From Hell, but that was like
Yeah, I
way
was
back
gonna
when I was like real young, and that's what got me into kind of Alan Moore and all that kind of delving of graphic novels. But in a way, like it's quite strange. I don't know if horror in graphic novels gets overshadowed. Like to me in film and other media, it's very at the front. It's very, this is going to be a scary movie or we're making a scary movie. Whereas in comics and sequential stuff, it's kind of like, I don't know if it just gets classified as horror or just gets classified to ones as like, oh no, this is just a comic book and then scary things happen in it. I don't know if you subconsciously read it and go, no, this is a horror graphic novel. Maybe that's just me overthinking it.
yeah, I think it's definitely something that's maybe not as recognised as I don't know. I think there's publishers like Dark Horse seem to specialise in
Hmm.
putting out really really good horror comics, but yeah, I do find it harder to hunt down. It's not really like its own. It's not really got its corner. I don't think within like the world of graphic novels. You don't really necessarily. If you're hunting for them in a shop, there won't be like a horror section as such in the way that you might with
Yeah.
films. Yeah, it's definitely not really maybe it's not like a huge or desired bit of the market yet, but I do think it's really good for. I think it's quite a difficult genre to convey in a comic, and when it's done well, it's just mind blowing. It's like so.
Yeah.
I think there's something quite visceral about really well done horror, visual and literal storytelling.
I think in a way it's got like, I mean, you just kind of hit the nail on the head when you said it's quite a difficult thing to do within graphic novels. I think you've kind of got within mystery and within kind of adventure and romance, you can hide details and it's very visual and people look at it and go, yeah, I'm seeing visuals, but I don't really know what's going on until I get the dialogue or vice versa. Whereas with horror, because so much of it is about suspense, as soon as you turn the
Mm,
page and you see a whole page, it kind of ruins that suspense for you if you're not already kind of
that's true.
suspending reality and going, no, I'm focused on what I'm looking at as I go through this. But then it's interesting to keep, I think, because I mean, in like Japan and manga, horror is huge. It's like a
Yeah.
huge, it's one of their main kind of tropes in a way. I'll try and remember the name of the guy, which I recently read. A friend lent me a manga, which was all about spirals.
Oh, Izumaki.
Yeah,
Is it
so
Ito?
yeah, and it was like with like the snails and the bodies and everything contortion. It's like that, and that again, it was like one of the, I did read a horror more recently than I thought I had. Completely forgot about. But yeah, I was kind of reading that, and that was one of the first few times I've read a graphic novel and been like, yeah, this is freaking me out. But it's a bombardment. Like it doesn't stop through the entire book. You just say, yeah, no, I'm weirded out by this whole thing. To me, that whole comic was kind of like a bombardment of imagery. Like you can't escape the horror in that one. Like even there's no like suspense to it. It's just an uneasy feeling throughout the entire thing. Um, but yeah, I think horror is quite hard to do visually in a way.
Yeah, I think he's really nailed it, and just he's got this weird. I'm a big fan of his work actually. He's just got a really weird way of tapping into, you know, bizarre psychological fears, which it's not always obvious horror. You know, just things like trypophobia, just be like
Mm.
lots of little holes in things, or you know, just things that are so bizarre it feels like you've had a mental snap rather than straightforward traditional horror. It's just sort of like a weird worm in your brain rather than, yeah. So I think he kind of just works really well. There's a few films like I don't know if you've seen the film of that comic, which I don't think works
Oh,
quite as well. It would be a budgeting issue, but it's just a bit corny and not very scary. But the comic itself is obviously brilliant and very scary.
I didn't even know there was a film of that.
Yeah, it's a weird sort of straight to DVD type thing.
I kind of want to see it. I might have to get hold of that. So me and one of my friends, we have we essentially have a film club where we watch bad films. We go to CEX, we spend 50p and try and get as many films as we can for under 50p. So we end up watching a pile of B movies. And recently we watched one. I think it was called The Recycler. And
Never
yeah,
heard of that.
yeah, and most of them no one's ever heard of because they're terrible. Like, but their big selling point was it had Malcolm McDowell on the front cover
Oh, that's
from
quite
Club.
interesting.
He was like, "Yeah, we sorry." I was like, "This could be pretty good." He's in it for 10 minutes at the beginning of the film, and then the rest of the film doesn't include him at all, and it's so dull until we realize it's like a thing of you get to the end 15 minutes of any bad film, and that's where they blow all their budget, and that's where it goes big, and you're like, "Yeah, actually, this is pretty good." But I'd recommend watching it if you like terrible films and like
Maybe just the beginning and the end.
yeah, just skip the middle. Don't just watch the beginning, watch the end of films. But that's quite interesting though that it kind of loses something being translated to film, which picks up horror quite easily in a way.
Mm.
Um, I
Yeah,
mean,
it's good for me, that one in particular. I'm trying to think of examples of stuff that it's worked. I'm sure there are. Can't really think of any on the spot.
I mean, From Hell worked when that was
Yeah, that's
adapted,
a decent film. Yeah, I think that was well handled actually.
but then that's to me that probably would have worked even without the graphic novel because
Yeah.
it's a known story. It's nothing that original in terms of narrative because it's the Ripper story. So you're basically just making a detective flick. I don't know. Like there's comics which I know of where I get worried about them trying to adapt them
Mm.
to screen. So my favorite graphic novel is Arkham Asylum,
Oh
um,
yeah.
which is the painted mixed media piece. And I'm in so much fear that one day someone's going to come and set along and say they're going to make an Arkham Asylum film because I just don't think it'll work.
Yeah, there is that, isn't there? Just when, you know, they run out of ideas and start butchering, well, like your beloved sort of, you know,
It's,
classic graphic novels.
can you ignore it when
There's
they
a
do that?
few there's a few that I don't know. I'm sort of intrigued though. I think there's a few that not necessarily always horror, but a few that have been done actually very well. Like I think the I don't know if you saw the TV series of Watchmen they did recently, which is obviously based on the comic, but it's kind of a follow-on from the film they did, which was kind of almost a frame for frame of the
Hmm.
comic. But that was really, really well done and took the Alan Moore story in a direction that I think felt in line with what he was trying to do, and it visually just felt right as well. And I think it's just so rare that happens. I really enjoyed that series. But yeah, that was TV, so again a bit different, but kind of
That,
worked.
that is kind of interesting though, because I think like I'm a person who I didn't enjoy the Watchmen film.
Yeah.
I don't know why. I'd never read the graphic novel, and I watched the film. And I kind of watched it, and I was like, I did not get why people had lauded it as much as they did. And I had friends who tried to explain it to me, and I just couldn't see it. Something about it just didn't quite sit right with me. And then I read the comic, and I was like, yeah, the comic's great. I don't I don't
Yeah.
kind of get it, but it's interesting when like a TV show manages to come in and do something like that because it's like is it Constantine a lot of people said the TV
Yeah.
show of that was really good, and I thought the film of that was quite good.
I don't think I've seen either. I think I've dipped into those comics, but I've not seen the film or the TV. So they're meant to be good.
The films, I like the film. It's a Keanu Reeves flick with him playing a grizzled occult detective. So you've already kind of got like a few things where you're like, this is probably going to be okay as an action
Yeah,
film.
I've not. I mean, that's everything that I enjoy wrapped in
Yeah,
one.
right.
I've
It's
not.
like a little bell on it. You're like, yeah, this is probably going to be okay. And yeah, like I haven't read too much of the comics. He's a character I know of, but he's a character I know of from other series, like when he's
Yeah,
popped up in other things.
yeah.
Trying to think if there's a comic series about a kid, which is basically Harry Potter, but it's not Harry Potter, and I think it's by Neil Gaiman.
Oh, yeah. Is it about magic? I'm sure it's something.
Something like that. I can't quite remember,
Yeah,
but he pops up in that, and I know him more from that than I actually know him from his own stuff.
I mean, I've forgotten all about that series, but you're right. Yeah, I'm pretty sure he is. I know the one you mean as well. Yeah,
Yeah, and I read a couple of those, but then yeah, they kind of came out, but then those series have a habit of getting cancelled. This
yeah.
seems to be the way at the moment. Every comic book series starts one series and then gets cancelled. Um, I mean, have you ever thought about making a graphic novel, doing a graphic novel?
Um, yes, a lot of times, but just always kind of realize it's a much bigger task than I
Yeah.
thought. I actually sort of like when I was just constantly temping and like hating my job. I'd
Mm.
always just I started making this comic, and it was really stupid. It was about like it's about this sort of like adopted. He was like a detective with like sort of psychic power. Oh, I don't know. It's so stupid. It's just very style of substance and basically probably subconsciously just stealing a lot of ideas from David Lynch films. But yeah, I do hope to. I think I'm not super confident in storytelling in terms of writing a story, but I'd absolutely love to illustrate for somebody else one day. That would be amazing to be a graphic novel artist. But it's just finding the time as well, isn't it? It's something that I'd
Mm.
obviously want to do well. And I think I'm constantly mentally storing. I've just read the most incredible example of comic book making and storytelling and art. One that I picked up that I'd asked for a few recommendations on Instagram, and it's called My Favorite Thing Is Monsters by Emil Ferris.
Okay.
And it's like this massive, meaty, really big, thick comic, but it's all in biro and there's no real structure. There's not necessarily panels. It's just like everything kind of exposed out the page. The storytelling is perfect. It's almost daunting when something like that exists. Like thinking, what is the point of me making a comic when this perfect comic exists? But yeah, I'd really recommend that to anybody. And it's not really necessarily a horror comic.
Mm.
I don't know. It feels almost kind of autobiographical, but it's not. It's about this young girl who's obsessed with B-movie horror films. It's set in the 60s in America, and she's kind of isolated in school and doesn't have many friends. So she creates these kind of fancy scenarios where she's a werewolf and she's trying to solve crimes in the building that she lives in. But it's just so perfect that,
Yeah.
things like that make me think, what could I do that would actually add to the genre?
Yeah, I kind of get that. So I mean, I made a comic uh, this year, released it this year,
Oh,
um,
nice.
called Potatropy, which is about the character which I draw called Potato Boy. Um, and it was is in a way it's kind of like single panel. It's not really sequential story based, but it was whenever I was making it because it took me like 2 years doing it on and off, and you don't realize how long it takes. Like it's going to be a big job, but you never know quite how big it's going to be. And then yeah, you do. You kind of like you go to stars and you're looking around thinking, well, this person's essentially doing what I've done but better. Or how do I get that? And whenever I think of kind of like an idea for another comic, I'm always kind of having to convince myself to do something and say, well, this person, yes, they've done something amazing and they've done something which I really want to do. But can I even challenge that, or is it worth that? But I think I don't know. I feel like you kind of have to do it anyway. in a
I
way.
completely agree. I was going to say, yeah, I think it's not a valid reason to not do things just because
Yeah.
the thing exists in another way or somebody else has done it. I think, and also as you say, like as with your work, I think a graphic novel or a comic can be anything really. Like it doesn't, it can be all on one page. It can,
Mm.
there's no. I think it's almost nice when things don't follow a traditional structure in comics. So you don't have to kind of set these really, I suppose, like the standard that I'm setting myself is based on these, particular styles of comic, and
Yeah.
that it doesn't have to be that at all. So yeah, it's always worth just having a go at it because you never know what you're going to actually achieve until you start it.
Yeah, and I think as well, like that becomes a thing. I think you see it quite a lot with people who've been doing art for quite a while, and I think your work's a great example because you do have such a bold, like confident approach to work because you're drawing and developing kind of those kinds of icons. Is that once you start making something, is not to bend whatever you're making to what you think you should be making, if that makes sense.
Definitely. Yeah.
You've got to dive in and go, okay, so this is what I want to make. It doesn't actually matter if people like it in the end. It doesn't matter if it's similar to what's out there or anything like that. It's just, no, this is what I'm making. This is how I want it to make it. Because then I think you'd be more satisfied with it.
Definitely, I think it's really important to just try and. I think some of my favourite comics are where somebody who has just sort of really played to their strengths. Like
Mm.
I've got another one here that I'll just quickly talk about by artist called Emily Carroll,
Okay.
and it's very much a folk horror comic called Through the Woods, and it's one that I return to all the time because it's only really thin and small, but Emily is just amazing at storytelling, and everything about the way that she compiles the stories and narrative is just so, it's just perfect. But it's not even that the illustrations are, they're not some of the best, in
Mm.
terms of draftsmanship. They're really really beautiful, but they're not necessarily about that. I think just the way that body horror is kind of depicted, and like this kind of, as you say, that slow, somehow there's like a slow burn, even though it's a comic and you're turning pages, there's a slow burn horror, and the storytelling is just bang on. And I think that's what makes things work, I suppose, when people, whoever's making the comic realizes, right, this is what I'm really good at.
Mm.
And stuff like, certain things can almost be secondary if you nail that one part of your strength. So
Yeah, I think with comics as well, I think pace is a huge thing. I think I've shown it to a couple of friends before who've said it takes them the same amount of time to read a comic as it would a traditional novel. They look at it, they read the page, they look at everything like that. Whereas I watch it like I would a film, and I kind of read the dialogue. My eyes scan the visuals, and then I move on. And it's very much I can read a comic in half the time. Um, and when you get someone who can make a book which makes you slow down
yeah,
and makes you
definitely.
really consider what you're looking at, I think, yeah, that's a really powerful trait. Like you say, yeah, it kind of overshadows in the sense of it doesn't matter if your text is a little off or your sketch isn't as clean as you want it to be, because it's like, yeah, you've managed to stop someone in their tracks, and that's
Yeah,
important.
and
I think that's the kind of the value of creating visual work as well. Is if you can manage to make someone stop, then you're succeeding overall.
yeah, I think like the pacing in graphic novels is just really, really clever, and it informs a lot of other kind of media, I reckon. I mean, we touched on Watchmen earlier, and that comic, I think it's really clear to see the way that some of the framing and just the pace and weird type of shot has been used, and like been used as kind of like a template for filmmaking. I think there's, considering what was it, early 80s, I think that comic was made.
Hmm.
We looking at that, there's just so much in it that I think I would never have thought to perhaps have the camera down there, or like have
Yeah.
this person there in the frame. And yeah, there's just that sort of pacing on every level, be it with the actual text and the visuals, is just so clever, I think, in comics. One of the things I love about it as a format.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, that kind of goes back to what we were saying about doing what you want to do when you make yours, because you don't know how it's going to inform other things. If you suddenly start doing things of like a different way of making something or a different way of producing work, when you put it out, you never know what that's going to cause down the line. So it could have a huge impact.
Yeah, true.
But I think that's a good point to round out on this before we lose connection again.
Okay, cool.
But thank you for coming to talk to me, Kim. It's been lovely
Oh, you're
speaking to you.
welcome. I enjoyed that. Thanks.
Good. And obviously, I'll leave some links and stuff so people can find your work. If there's anything specific, you can just drop me a link. But otherwise, I hope you have a lovely day.
And you, thank you.
We'll round this out, and that will be the end of that.